Well, the reality is we're, $54 trillion plus in the hole, and what that means to every American is it's hundreds of thousands of dollars that they owe. And I don't think that they're aware of this unfunded liability that we all carry that's going to provide a tremendous economic challenge to future generations. We impose accounting principles on publicly traded companies, even on private small businesses, because it results in transparency and accountability, and it's tools that people can use to make good decisions. The federal government chooses not to follow the same accounting principles that they impose on everybody else. I used to be CEO of a publicly traded company, and if our company had accounted for its business the way the federal government accounts for its business, I'd be in jail. I think that's unacceptable, and the American people deserve to have a government that reports the fiscal reality of this country in a way that we can make decisions that lead to better policy to put us all in a better position to be able to meet the fiscal challenges that we have in the future. When I was in Congress, I introduced, along with Congressman Kurt from Illinois and Congressman Cooper from Tennessee, a bill called the Truth in Accounting Act. And all it required was that the federal government simply state the true unfunded liabilities of this country, which at the time was over $50 trillion. Today it's higher. And it was simply to try to define a problem so we could work towards a solution. I think to solve any problem, you have to define it first. The federal government does not define the fiscal reality that we face in the future. And we have to have tools in place to be able to make good decisions, to be able to fund the unfunded liabilities like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest. And by 2030, which isn't that far from now, we will have more bills in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest than we have in federal revenue. That means there's no Department of Defense, there's no Department of Education, there's no Department of anything. And so the sooner we act, the more responsible we will be. The longer before we react, the more painful it will be, and our options will be very limited. And so the bill was simply to try to initiate the discussion, to provide the tools to be able to develop good policy, and to bring it to the citizens and the voters' attention so they demand that our public officials actually start to address this in a responsible way. When we introduced the legislation that we called Truth in Accounting, the reaction was mixed. The voters were confused because they didn't really know what that meant. They've heard of the annual deficit, they've heard of the national debt, but they'd really never heard of the unfunded liabilities over $50 trillion. And so it took them, some time to try to figure out what are you talking about. But when you explained that it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they start to understand and grasp the magnitude of the issue. The bigger problem is that the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, the administration, they don't want anything to do with this because they don't want, number one, the American people really to know the extent of the problem because then we have to address it. You can't point out a problem without offering a solution. Two is that they say the federal government is incapable of following the same rules in accounting that they require Microsoft, GM, and every other huge company in the United States follow. I think if we can require the private sector to follow these rules because it results in transparency and accountability, I think we ought to require the federal government to follow the same rules. And there's really no reason that they can't. You make estimations, you look into the future and try to put your best estimate on what these numbers are going to be so you can make the best decisions today to be able to meet your obligations in the future. After I introduced the Truth in Accounting bill, I became aware of the Institute for Truth in Accounting. I met Sheila Weinberg. I think we met in a meeting with David Walker, who was then the head of the GAO. And we talked about the importance of making this a much broader known issue amongst the citizens of our country because it's important that they understand the fiscal challenges that we face together. And it's important that we find tools to be able to communicate that and hold our elected officials responsible for addressing it in a responsible way. If we don't find ways to make this more heightened public awareness, we are going to get to the point where all the solutions that are available to us are extremely painful, are going to provide our children with limited opportunities, are going to have real economic impact in a negative way to our country. And so the sooner we can address this, the sooner we can broaden awareness, and the sooner we can do something about it, the much better off we all are. One of the amazing things is we hear the presidential candidates talk about everything except this issue. They rarely talk about unfunded liabilities and how we're going to address them responsibly. And I think that that should be the first questions that Americans, as they go to the polls, should have. Because I think it's the biggest problem we face is we talked about by 2030 we're going to have more in bills and unfunded liabilities than we have in federal revenue. And so if presidential candidates aren't willing to address this issue responsibly now, and they pass it on to future presidents or future generations, our options are going to be very limited to how to do this in a responsible and effective way. And so I think it's important that we ask them that question. We get detailed answers on how they're going to address the problem, and we evaluate our votes in a significant way on how they answer that. I think the people in Washington don't share with us what our full unfunded liabilities are. Number one, there aren't the tools in place to be able to really share it. The Treasury Department puts out a thing they call the Financial Report of the U.S. government. They put it out on usually Christmas Eve. They usually print a couple hundred copies of it, and so they don't share it widely. Many members of Congress aren't even aware it exists, and so there isn't the distribution of information that's necessary to make sure everyone understands it. But there's also not a willingness to go out and seek to understand, because again, if you understand the problem, if you point out the problem, and then we're going to ask our elected officials, well, how are you going to fix the problem? And so they really don't want to be asked that question, and so we have to ask them that question. We have to push for them to release the information, to do it in an accurate way that clearly reflects the magnitude of the problem by using the same accounting standards that we require businesses to use by law. And then I think we can make the step towards finding solutions after we define the problem first, and then we can hold our elected officials much more accountable, and that's not always what they want. I think if people had a clear understanding of the magnitude of the problem of unfunded liabilities in this country, they would, number one, be scared. Number two, I think that they would start to attend political functions like town hall meetings, and they'd start to demand answers. And so, again, in order to solve problems, you have to define problems. As soon as people understand the definition, I think that they'll start thinking about their kids and their grandkids and how are we really going to meet these obligations that we've made? How are we really going to keep Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid viable programs, which are important programs, alive so that they can meet the obligations and the promises that we've made to future generations? And so the bottom line is we have to hold our elected officials accountable to share the information accurately and then to address it. And the only way we're going to get there is if the American people start to demand it. And that's why we need to make sure that we push for the sharing of the information and that we push for the solutions, and we refuse to support candidates or vote for people asking to be office holders if they won't answer this question. How are you going to address the unfunded liabilities that this nation faces, and how are you going to do it in a responsible way that will live up to the obligations that we've made to future generations?